What's the moment you realized your spouse had a second life you knew nothing about? I still remember the exact moment my entire world shattered under the weight of one simple discovery. It was a quiet Sunday evening in our cozy suburban, the kind of night that usually ended with me curled up on the couch beside my husband, a good TV show flickering across the screen. That evening, though, he was out. He'd told me he had to check on some late project at the office, which wasn't unusual in itself. Jake often worked after hours, claiming deadlines popped up without warning, or that clients in different time zones needed immediate attention. I never questioned it too seriously. He was a responsible guy, a hard worker, and he provided for us comfortably. I trusted him. But that night, my phone buzzed with an email notification. We shared a family email address for certain bills and other household logistics, the sort of thing couples do to stay organized. But I'd never seen anything like this come through before. It was a notification from a credit card company we didn't normally use, alerting us that an online purchase had been declined. Intrigued, I opened it, fully expecting some kind of spam. Then I saw my husband's name attached to the account, with a billing address I didn't recognize. Right there, listed in black and white, was an entirely different home address. At first, I told myself it must be a mistake, some identity theft, a random glitch in the system. I tried to calm my racing thoughts. People got strange emails all the time, right? Maybe this was just a scam. But something about that address triggered a flicker of déjà vu. I tried to recall if I'd heard it before, maybe in passing conversation, but nothing came to mind. I paced around the living room, the quiet hum of the heater filling the otherwise silent house. Our dog Luna, a sweet golden retriever, watched me from her spot by the sliding glass door, sensing my anxiety. I decided to check the rest of the mail we'd recently gotten. Normally, I let Jake handle most of the finances. He liked control, and I'd never minded that. So I headed to his office at the back of our house, the one room I rarely ventured into unless I was asked to fetch a folder or a piece of mail. His desk was cluttered with paperwork, software manuals, coffee-stained sticky notes. He'd been reorganizing recently, or so he claimed, which left half the drawers half open and the other half jammed with random items he'd never found proper places for. I figured I'd skim quickly to see if there was any reference to that suspicious address or that random credit card. As I was flipping through a stack of envelopes, I spotted something that made my breath catch, a glossy official letter from a life insurance company I'd never heard of. The policy number was new to me, and the name of the insured party was indeed Jake. But the beneficiary? It wasn't me. It listed a woman named Julia Henderson, with 2 minors noted as dependents. My stomach twisted. The letter mentioned the same unfamiliar address from the email. My mind started spinning with questions. Who was Julia Henderson? Why would my husband list her on a life insurance policy? Who were these minors? Why that address? A cold sweat broke out across my forehead, and I could actually feel my heart pounding against my ribcage. With trembling fingers, I scanned the rest of the letter, desperately searching for an explanation that might make sense. The letter's tone was formal, referencing some changes Jake had recently made to the policy, some additional coverage. I could barely believe what I was reading. I felt a strange heaviness in my chest, as though the oxygen in the room had suddenly thinned out. I dropped down into his swivel chair, pressing a hand to my forehead. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but there was no rational explanation. Was Jake living a second life? Did he have another partner? Children? The more I thought about it, the more pieces seemed to slot into place. All those late-night meetings, the mysterious weekend trips, the times he claimed to be helping his brother renovate a house one stayed over. The memory of the first time I met Jake popped into my head, unbidden. We were in our late 20s then, both living in Chicago. I was fresh out of grad school and working at a small tech startup, while he was a sales manager at a local firm. I'd known from the moment I met him that he was charming in a quiet, confident way. He had a gentlemanly manner, always opening doors for me and remembering little details like how I took my coffee or that I hated mushrooms on pizza. He made me feel safe, valued, and heard. And yet here I was, sitting in his office, discovering something so outlandish my mind could barely process it. I told myself I needed more proof before I confronted him. The insurance policy and the credit card email were bizarre, but I had to be absolutely certain of what was going on. Maybe there was a different explanation. What if Julia Henderson was a cousin or an aunt or something? But then, why the children? And why a life insurance policy naming her as the primary beneficiary? My hands shook as I dug deeper into the file drawers, rummaging through random papers. Most were boring documents, receipts, manuals, old tax returns. Then, near the bottom of one drawer, I found a plain, unmarked folder. Inside were photos, And not just any photos, but pictures of Jake with a woman I'd never seen before. They stood side by side in front of what looked like a Christmas tree. He wore a festive sweater, his arm around her waist. She looked happy, radiant even, and he looked like the man I knew so well, the one who always gave that warm, comfortable smile. My heart pounded as I flipped through them. One picture showed them holding two little girls, maybe 4 and 6 years old. The older one had Jake's freckles. For a few seconds, my eyes refused to believe what I was seeing. But there it was, undeniable. My husband was in a whole other family photo. The timestamp on the back showed it was from last Christmas, when he'd supposedly been stuck in Denver at a sales conference. I felt nauseous, like the floor was buckling beneath me. I actually staggered as I got to my feet. Somehow, I managed to put everything back in place, though my mind screamed at me to tear the entire room apart in rage. Instead, I forced myself to remain calm and methodical. I slipped out of the office with the printouts, the letter, and the photos safely in my hands, then made my way to the living room couch where I sat in stunned silence. For maybe half an hour, I couldn't move. I just stared at the paperwork, rereading the lines, re-examining the photographs. My phone buzzed. Another email, this time from Jake himself with the subject line, "Working late again." He was letting me know he'd be home after midnight. Typical. Usually, I'd simply text him back something sweet, telling him to drive safely, but tonight I didn't respond at all. There was nothing I wanted to say to him in that moment. 1,000 thoughts ricocheted through my brain. Should I call him and confront him right away? Storm over to his office with these photos in hand? Or should I wait, gather all the facts, and then decide how to proceed? A part of me wanted to bury my head in the sand, hoping there might still be some logical, if far-fetched, explanation. Another part of me wanted to unleash a hurricane of fury on him. I finally decided the best thing I could do was be prepared. My father always told me that whenever we face a crisis, it's better to act with a cool head than with an impulsive heart. So I took photos of the documents, stored digital copies in a secure folder on my laptop, and forwarded the suspicious email to my personal address for safekeeping. I even jotted down the address from the credit card statement so I wouldn't forget. I had no idea what I was going to do with all that information, but it felt important to protect it. That night, I didn't sleep. I tried, but every time I closed my eyes, I pictured Jake's face in those photographs, smiling alongside that woman and those kids, weaving a tapestry of lies. I kept hearing his voice telling me how he had big dreams for our future. He wanted to move to a better neighborhood in a few years, maybe have our own kids soon. He said he was open to that once he got a promotion. How did that fit with these children in the photos, who literally had his features? By the time the clock read 2 a.m., I found myself walking circles in the living room, mind racing, imagining him with his other family somewhere across town. Did they celebrate birthdays together? Did those little girls call him Daddy? My throat felt like it was closing up. Jake finally came home at 2:30. He tried to be quiet, but I was fully awake, perched on the sofa. The moment he stepped inside, I saw a flash of alarm in his eyes when he noticed I was up. "Hey," he said softly, trying to muster a casual smile. "I didn't expect you to wait up." "I couldn't sleep," I told him, the words catching in my throat. "How was work?" He shrugged, dropping his keys on the coffee table. Same old, same old. Clients demanding miracles at the last minute." He inched closer, leaning over to kiss my forehead, but I pulled away, ignoring the hurt that flickered in his eyes. "You okay?" he asked, feigning concern. I wanted to slap him. Instead, I forced a thin, strained smile. "Yeah, just tired." He nodded and excused himself to take a shower. I watched him head down the hallway, every muscle in my body tensed. I could have exploded right then, but I didn't. And I hated myself a little for that. Part of me felt cowardly, but another part insisted that I needed more time. The next day, I took off work, telling my boss I had a personal emergency. Then I drove to the address from the credit card statement. My mind was in a whirl as I navigated through a part of the city I rarely visited, an older, more historic district with rows of charming, mid-century houses. After about 20 minutes of searching, I finally found the place, a pale blue bungalow with a small porch and a neat front yard, potted plants lining the windows. Parking a little way down the street, I watched the house in my rearview mirror, my heart hammering so loudly I could barely think. Was I really about to do this? Part of me felt like I was trespassing on someone else's life. Then again, apparently that someone else had intruded on mine first. There was no car in the driveway, so I wasn't sure if anyone was home. Summoning my courage, I walked up to the door and rang the bell. My stomach was in knots. A few seconds later, a woman answered. She looked about my age, early 30s, maybe a shade younger. She had warm brown hair pulled into a ponytail, a casual sweater on. She smiled politely, clearly not recognizing me. "Can I help you?" she asked. I tried to speak, but my mouth went dry. How was I supposed to say, "Hi, I'm your partner's other wife"? So instead, I said I was looking for someone named Jake Turner, and that I thought he might live here or visit. Her eyes widened, confusion flickering across her face. "I'm sorry, who are you?" she asked more firmly. A part of me wanted to run, but I caught the tremble in her voice. She was scared. Maybe part of her already suspected something was off. "My name is Rachel Turner," I said quietly. And the minute I did, her face went pale. "I'm Jake's wife." For a moment, neither of us spoke. She stared at me as though I'd just told her the sky was pink. Then her eyebrows knit together in disbelief. "That's impossible," she said, voice shaking. "Jake isn't married. He's divorced. And even if he was, you're not—" I pulled the folded photos from my purse, the same ones I'd found in Jake's office. My hands trembled as I handed them over. "I found these in my home, with your address, with your name on the paperwork for his life insurance. I'm sorry." She stared at the pictures, her mouth open, tears starting to form in her eyes. "I'm Julia," she managed, though I already knew. She stepped aside automatically, letting me in. Her house smelled of cinnamon, some candle or air freshener. My eyes swept over the neat living area, the children's toys in the corner, a small pair of pink sneakers lying near the couch. "I don't understand," she said, gesturing for me to sit. "Jake told me he'd been divorced for 2 years. She pressed a hand to her forehead, struggling to contain her emotions. For the next hour, we compared notes. Heartbreak scrawled across both our faces. She had known Jake for 4 years. He'd told her he was newly separated when they first met. They were friends for a bit, then started dating, eventually moving in together. He even helped pick out that blue bungalow, claimed he wanted a quiet place for them and her daughters from a previous relationship. Apparently, the father was out of the picture. Only now, as I looked at a framed photo on the side table, did I notice that one of the little girls had the same bright hazel eyes as Jake. My stomach turned. It turned out her younger daughter was actually Jake's biological child. Julia confessed she got pregnant early on in their relationship. She thought Jake had been thrilled about it, especially since he'd said he felt guilty for not being there for her older child in a more paternal capacity. And all the while, he'd been telling me he wasn't ready for kids, that we needed more financial stability first. The sense of betrayal seared my insides. After I left Julia's house, feeling hollow and numb, I sat in my car for nearly an hour, just staring at the steering. It was bizarre to realize my entire life had been a facade. The sweet, loving husband I thought I knew spent half of his time in some parallel universe, fathering a child and playing daddy to another. For a moment, I felt like a ghost in my own life, drifting through illusions. I drove home in a daze. Part of me wanted to pack my bags and leave that very night, vanish into the wind so I'd never have to look Jake in the eye again. Another part, though, wanted him to face me, to explain himself. Anger was building within me like a hot flame. By the time I pulled into our driveway, I'd made my decision. I'd confront him to no more waiting. When he walked in at 6 p.m., calling out that he'd picked up Thai food for dinner, I was standing in the hallway, a stack of papers in hand. The insurance policy, the photos, a couple of other documents. My face must have said everything because as soon as he saw me, his expression contorted into fear and dismay. "What's all this?" he asked, feigning confusion. "You tell me," I replied coolly, though I was trembling inside. I shoved the photos in his hands. I took a grim sort of satisfaction in watching his face blanch as he recognized them. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Finally, he stammered, "Rachel, this isn't what it looks like." I almost laughed. How many times had that cliché been uttered in the face of a blatant betrayal? "Really? Because it looks like you've been lying to me for years. It looks like you have another woman, another family. Children, Jake." He raked a hand through his hair, sweaty and panicked. "Please," he whispered. "Can we just talk about this calmly?" Calmly? I was practically spitting with anger. "You have a second life, Jake. There's no calm way to discuss that. Did you think I'd never find out? That I was so stupid in trusting you could juggle me and Julia and neither of us would ever notice?" He frowned. "Julia? So you've talked to her. She told me everything, or what she knows anyway. I saw her kids, Jake. I saw your child, your daughter. Do you know how that made me feel?" He tried to step toward me, arms half raised like he wanted to comfort me, but I jerked away. "Don't you dare," I hissed. "I don't want your touch. I don't even know who you are anymore." He sank down on the bottom stair, burying his face in his hands. "I never meant for it to go this far," he said at last, voice muffled. "When I met Julia, I was unhappy. You and I were fighting a lot back then, remember? She was just someone to talk to. And then she got pregnant. I panicked. I didn't want to lose you, but I couldn't abandon her and her kid. I thought I could handle both lives. I never wanted to hurt you." His words hit me like a physical blow. I remembered that rough patch we'd gone through about 4 years earlier. Some money issues, job stress. Sure, we argued, but that's marriage, right? At least I'd believed so. I had never in a million years thought he'd respond by starting another relationship. My voice trembled with rage and heartbreak. You never wanted to hurt me, yet you built an entire second household behind my back? Do you even realize what you've done? You have a secret child, Jake. Multiple children effectively. He stood up again, tears in his eyes. I love you, Rachel. I swear, I love you. I can't imagine my life without you. But Julia, I felt responsible. And I do love her too. She's the mother of my child. I know it's messed up, okay? I'm sorry. His admission that he also loved her made me want to tear my hair out. Everything was swirling like I was in a nightmare. I told him I couldn't look at him, couldn't speak to him. I needed him to get out. He tried to plead, but I pointed at the door. My voice was ice. Leave, now. He left, shoulders slumped in defeat. And for the next 3 days, I avoided him completely. He called and texted constantly, leaving voicemails about how sorry he was, how he'd do anything to fix this. But all I could feel was this swirling cocktail of betrayal and heartbreak. My family, my mother, my sister, had no idea any of this was happening. I thought about calling them, but I couldn't stand the idea of explaining what a fool I'd been, how thoroughly I'd been deceived. Instead, I confided in my best friend, Lisa. She came over with takeout and a few bottles of cheap wine, and I let everything spill out over the living room table. She listened, tears in her eyes for me, shaking her head in outrage whenever I'd reveal another detail of Jake's web of lies. She promised I wasn't stupid, that I'd had no reason not to trust him. She also pointed out that it was normal to love someone and feel utter hatred at the same time when they'd done something so atrocious. We spent that night drafting up potential strategies, seeing a lawyer, demanding a divorce, even possibly confronting Julia together. But I told Lisa that Julia didn't deserve my anger. Jake was the one who had lied to us both. Julia was just as much a victim as I was. Lisa sighed, agreed, and helped me research some of the best family law attorneys in town. The next week was a blur of phone calls, clandestine meetings with lawyers, and me trying to function at my job without breaking down. I set up an appointment for therapy because my emotions felt so intense I feared I might lose myself. Meanwhile, Jake was staying at a motel, or so he claimed when we did speak on the phone. He kept saying he'd do anything to make this right, asking me for a chance to talk in person. Eventually, I agreed to meet him at a neutral place, a small coffee shop on the outskirts of town. The last thing I wanted was him stepping foot in our home, the place he'd desecrated with his deceptions. When I arrived, he was already sitting at a corner table, looking hollowed out by guilt and exhaustion. I hated how my heart still twisted painfully at the sight of him. He started by apologizing, then explaining again that he'd never set out to juggle 2 lives forever. He told me he loved me and that his relationship with Julia had begun as a misguided fling, a moment of weakness in the worst of our marital struggles. Then she became pregnant, and he felt trapped. You felt trapped? I echoed, voice shaking with rage. What about me, Jake? What about the choice you stole from me? Don't you think I deserve to know that my husband had fathered a child with someone else? He looked at his coffee cup like it held the answers. I know. I was a coward. I just kept thinking I'd handle it somehow, but time slipped by and everything snowballed. Then I realized I cared for Julia too, and I couldn't abandon my daughter, but I also didn't want to lose you. And in the meantime, you gave me false hope about our future. Tears burned my eyes. You said you wanted kids with me one day. How could you say that, knowing you already had a child with someone else? He buried his face in his hands, seeming genuinely devastated, but I couldn't bring myself to feel compassion. I'd lost so much because of him. At some point in the conversation, he admitted that Julia knew nothing of me. He'd told her he was legally divorced. She believed him because he never spent the night away from her except for business trips. He'd apparently kept a meticulous schedule to maintain both illusions. I couldn't listen anymore. When I left that coffee shop, I told him flatly I needed a separation, at least until I decided if there was any chance I could forgive him. He asked if I'd come to therapy with him, but I just walked away, tears streaming down my face. Over the next few weeks, I wrestled with more conflicting emotions than I thought were humanly possible. Part of me wanted closure, to walk away from him for good. Another part of me, though I almost hated to admit it, still loved him, still yearned for the man I'd married, the man who used to bring me flowers for no reason and text me sweet messages during the day. But how could I trust anything he said or did now? I spoke to Julia again, briefly. She was in as much turmoil as I was, trying to figure out what to do for her daughters. She raged at Jake too, feeling betrayed by his lies, though she admitted she still cared for him because he'd been kind and supportive when she needed it most. It was a nightmare. Both of us felt like pawns in his grand deception. Time inched forward. The nights were the worst, when the house was cold and quiet, and my memories tormented me. I would stare at the ceiling, recalling the day I'd said, I do. how confident I'd been in our future, how safe I felt in his arms. Now, that sense of safety was gone, replaced by heartbreak and suspicion. Eventually, I filed for a legal separation. I needed to protect myself financially, especially now that I knew about his second family. I wasn't sure if I wanted a full divorce yet, but I couldn't risk discovering that he'd drained our accounts to fund a life elsewhere. I had long phone calls with lawyers, with accountants, asking questions I never thought I'd have to ask. Meanwhile, he continued to call and text, sometimes showing up at the house when he knew I was at work, leaving flowers or letters of apology on the doorstep. A part of me ached reading those notes because I knew a piece of him probably meant every word. But another part hardened against him, reminding me that if he was truly sorry, he'd never have done this in the first place. At one point, I decided to see him again, but this time with a marriage counselor. It was surreal to sit there in a small, warmly lit office, across from this man who had once been my best friend, while a therapist gently guided us through the wreckage of our relationship. Jake apologized repeatedly. He claimed he'd end things with Julia if that's what I wanted, but then tears would fill his eyes whenever he talked about his child. He said he couldn't abandon his daughter. I was torn between my own heartbreak and a glimmer of understanding. Of course, he couldn't just walk away from his kid. I wouldn't want him to be that kind of man anyway. But how could I possibly stay married to him, knowing he had this entire other life, these obligations and ties to Julia and her oldest daughter? How would we ever rebuild trust? The counselor suggested a lengthy healing process, but I had no idea if I was even willing to attempt it. My friends and family, once they learned the truth, were incensed. My sister Kelly practically threatened to dismember Jake if he ever came near me again. My parents, who had adored him for his kindness and reliability, were shell-shocked, though they tried to be supportive. They told me they would understand whatever choice I made, but they couldn't hide their anger at Jake's betrayal. Meanwhile, Julia found herself in a mirrored predicament. She loved him, hated him, felt betrayed, and yet worried about how her daughters would cope without him around. We spoke a couple more times, each conversation a swirl of sorrow and confusion. Some might think we'd hate each other, but we didn't. We both recognized that the real culprit was Jake's deception, not each other. As weeks bled into months, I noticed a change in myself. I started having panic attacks at random moments, like when I drove past the hotel where he'd claimed to be staying one weekend. My sense of self-worth wavered. Had I been so unlovable that he had to find someone else? Logically, I knew it wasn't about my worth, but that logical understanding didn't always quell the emotional agony. My therapist helped me see that I was grappling not only with betrayal, but also with the loss of the future I'd envisioned. Eventually, Jake proposed a last-ditch attempt at saving our marriage. He'd break off his romantic involvement with Julia, but remain in his daughter's life strictly as a co-parent. He'd talk to a lawyer about formal custody or visitation arrangements. In parallel, he said, he wanted me to consider couples therapy full-time to see if we could mend the rift. I was torn. Part of me wanted to say no, wanted to run from him forever. Another part felt an echo of the love we once shared, remembering the good times, the warmth of his smile, the way we'd felt so right together. Could people truly come back from a betrayal like this? Maybe some could, but I wasn't sure if I was one of them. In the end, I agreed to try counseling, but we kept living separately. I had conditions. He would be fully transparent about his finances, his schedule, and any contact with Julia. No more secrets, no more lies. If I caught him hiding even the smallest thing, I was done. He agreed, desperate for any chance to win back some semblance of trust. That began an incredibly difficult period of my life, one marked by countless arguments, tearful confessions, and a sense that our marriage was hanging by a thread. Jake did everything he could to prove he was serious about changing. He transferred all his financial accounts into joint status, shared his phone's location with me, gave me every password he had. He had meetings with lawyers about setting up legal paternity for his daughter, child support, visitation rights. Meanwhile, Julia stepped back, though she maintained contact for the sake of their child. She expressed that she couldn't continue a romantic relationship with him after what he'd done, not just to me, but to her. Still, she wanted him to be a father to their daughter, and I didn't blame her for that. It was messy, painful. At times, I found myself weeping over the simplest things, like a commercial for happy families, or a couple holding hands at the grocery store. I felt robbed of the sweet innocence I used to have, that naive certainty in my marriage. Through therapy, though, I started to realize that whether Jake and I stayed together or not, I needed to heal for my own sake. My world had been shaken, but it wasn't over. I slowly began finding pieces of myself again, spending time with friends, reconnecting with my passions for painting and running, things I'd neglected while drowning in heartbreak. Jake, to his credit, worked hard to own his mistakes. He faced my anger, my tears, my blame, without shutting down or storming off. In some twisted way, I began to see how deeply flawed he was, how he'd been operating from a place of fear and weakness rather than malice. It didn't justify a thing, but it made me realize that my devastation wasn't because he never loved me. It was because he loved me in a selfish, immature way, failing to be honest, failing to choose me fully when it mattered most. Months passed, and eventually I found myself at a crossroads. The separation was nearing a point where we needed to decide if we'd pursue divorce or attempt genuine reconciliation. Jake had moved out of the motel and was renting a small apartment while we navigated therapy. He still saw his daughter regularly, though not as often as he wanted. Julia was polite but guarded, focusing on her own future. I remember a particular session with my therapist when she asked me, "Rachel, what do you truly want? If there were no guilt or external pressure, what would you choose for yourself?" I sat there, tears slipping down my cheeks, and for the first time, I admitted aloud that I wasn't sure I could ever trust Jake again. That maybe my love for him wasn't enough to conquer the betrayal. Telling him that was one of the hardest conversations of my life. We met at the park where we used to walk Luna on lazy weekends. He looked hopeful at first, but as I started to speak, tears welled in his eyes. I told him I forgave him as a human being. I believed he was remorseful, but I couldn't keep fighting the memory of his deception. It haunted. I needed to find my own path forward, without the weight of his secrets pulling me back into darkness. He cried and I cried, and we held each other for what felt like hours. He promised he'd always be there if I changed my mind, that he'd love me forever. I felt heartbreak, but also a strange lightness, like I was finally letting go of a burden. Not long after, I filed for divorce. The proceedings went more smoothly than one might expect, largely because Jake cooperated. He didn't contest anything. I agreed not to go after any assets he'd spent on Julia, because I just wanted to move on. Looking back, maybe I could have demanded more, but it wasn't about money. I just wanted peace. Some people around me judged my decision. Some thought I should have tried harder to reconcile. Others couldn't imagine why I'd even consider staying for a second. But no one else was in my shoes, feeling my exact feelings. In the end, I made the choice I believed was right for my own future. 6 months after the divorce, I found myself living in a new apartment downtown. I kept Luna with me, naturally. She'd always been my rock. I started taking painting classes at a local studio, exploring a side of me I'd abandoned years ago. My days were quieter, but they were mine. I'd have moments of sadness, sure. Memories don't vanish overnight. Sometimes I'd stumble on an old photo or recall a sweet memory, and tears would sting my eyes. But overall, I was healing. It's been over a year now since I discovered Jake's second life, and sometimes I still look back and wonder how I missed the signs. Hindsight is vicious that way, but I try not to be too harsh on myself. I trusted the man I loved, and that's not a flaw. It was simply a leap of faith that he misused.